Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. So I'd like to start by thanking the organizers and NHC and the other sponsors. It's a wonderful opportunity. It's my first visit to the Middle East, and having read obviously about the mega projects in Saudi, it was quite exciting for me to come visit and meet people and experience the country and culture, obviously in Riyadh. So thank you for the opportunity. So I'm based in South Africa, in Johannesburg, and my work is focused on sub-Saharan Africa, including Mauritius. So I'm a proud South African, as you can see with my socks. That's the South African flag. And I'm a proud African. So I do have European ties, but I'm very passionate about South Africa, and having lived in Europe, I was always going to return. I was there for a few years. So I'm very passionate about my country, and I see that here, obviously, and I think that's quite important. So African PropTech markets, Africa is obviously massive, it's very diverse, and you need to break it down into the regions to start looking at common characteristics. So North Africa, West Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa. So they're all very unique in their own ways. But common trends is we are emerging markets with different levels sort of on the development spectrum in terms of countries, in terms of real estate market, sophistication and developments, etc. So it's a very diverse continent. So being emerging, we do have a lot of inequality, a big demand for affordable housing, which we've heard here. So when you're doing business in Africa, obviously it doesn't always happen, but talking about ESG, you could argue the social element is more pressing than environmental or governance in emerging markets, because you have people living in abject poverty. So this is in Johannesburg. So you have on the left is an estate or a compound. So middle class and up for security mostly, you live in these compounds, but it's very, the contrast is real in certain areas. So on the right is informal housing or shacks built with metal sheets and other material. So the government's delivered since democracy in 94, it's delivered 6-7 million houses, but the need is drastic, and unfortunately our governments aren't always very effective. So it's wonderful here to see the government support for the massive real estate expansion, the PropTech, talking to the agencies yesterday in small medium enterprises, entrepreneurship and digital economy. We're seeing that. So in South Africa, we're seeing some of that, but public sector support is often limited or missing. So it means we have very, very strong, capable private sector companies. And looking at South Africa, we have a number of corporates that have expanded internationally, banking, finance, insurance. In real estate, our real estate investment trusts are active in numerous European countries, the UK, Australia, the US. So we're very sophisticated in that way. And you see varying levels of sophistication across wider West and East Africa. I'm not an expert on North Africa. It tends, the regions, the Middle East, Europe, Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa are quite unique in their ways. So you can't really talk about Africa. You need to kind of break it down to at least a regional level. And I play in Sub-Saharan Africa. So, before you start anything, you need to consider, I think, the pressing social issues. And in being in real estate, you need to, if you're developing certain things, you should think about having a positive social impact, jobs, housing, education, health. And housing is directly linked to health, to education, to sort of lifting people out of poverty. So it's really important. So key regions, the cities I just spoke about. So West Africa, Lagos is the hub. It's the tech hub, the economic hub. It's quite a big city, 16 million. East Africa is Nairobi. Again, very strong hub. The African UN headquarters are in Nairobi. So it's quite a hub in terms of diplomatic, NGOs, business, and also very strong tech. Obviously Kairos, obviously I know less about North Africa, but that's obviously a big city, very important player in the region, and some very exciting PropTech activity. So you see Egyptian startups raising money and achieving quite good success. And then Johannesburg, where I'm from, yeah, so we're on 6 million, but depending how you sort of outline the city limits, we are up to 10 million. And obviously most people know Cape Town. It's beautiful. We wouldn't call it a business hub, but it's a wonderful city. But Johannesburg's the economic hub of arguably sub-Saharan Africa, and it's seen as a gateway for multinationals into the continent. But we do see that obviously Nairobi is quite strong for that as well. So what's interesting is technology has really helped to bridge certain divides. So talking about the social element. So traditional banking in South Africa, it's quite established, and we've found ways to reach the lower segments of the market. But places like Kenya were massively innovative, using GSM phone technology, so not even smartphones, you don't need data, 5G, 3G. They use GSM phone technology where you could make and receive mobile payments like via SMS. It's called M-Pesa, it's been around for years. So it's a great example of the innovation about building a tech product for your market. So you can't always import. You can obviously sometimes, but every country is very dynamic. Its real estate markets are dynamic and unique. So it's important to obviously look globally, but consider your local dynamics and engage thoroughly with your local PropTech community, which I see happening in Saudi. So it's a global perspective, but local focus is important. So there's just a few stats. So mobile money accounts are massive. So half mobile users in sub-Saharan Africa use their phones to make payments. The main fintech hubs are South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, and M-Pesa's there. So it has over 30 million users now in 10 different countries. So M-Pesa's, it is fintech, it's not PropTech, but it's a good example of an African tech innovation. So this is funding, venture capital funding for overall tech startups on the continent. So data on PropTech funding is a bit patchy still. We have a long way to go. The maturity of our PropTech sector is still on the lower end of the scale, and we account for a tiny bit of overall VC funding, which is a similar trend I've seen in Saudi, in the UAE. Looking at some stats, last year PropTech funding was 2.6% of overall tech VC funding in Saudi, considering UAE as well. And just for local context, I do have some sources if anyone's interested on this data. So first half of this year, Saudi PropTechs have raised $500 million, which is quite good, but obviously if you compare it to the wider VC tech funding, you'll see that the proportion is still small. Interesting given the fact real estate is nearing a 400 trillion dollar asset class globally. So we've got a long way to go, which is exciting, and seeing the Saudi PropTech hub is really important. Being a co-founder of PropTech associations in Africa myself, they play a very important role. So you can see, again, relative to global VC funding, Africa gets a relatively small portion, but the growth in the last 10 years has been exponential, and it will continue to grow. We've got young population, we've got growing economies, improving governance in some countries. Political stability is a luxury in Africa, but it's getting better. So it's only going to grow. And there's a lot of talk about Africa and its importance. And there's been a lot of hype for 10 years, and it's been up and down, but the projections are clear. It's going to be really important. Because we have really solid tech ecosystems, we have very good professional services, but we have minerals, which obviously natural resources, I don't have to tell the crowd here, is very important. Like the Congo, they have some of the largest cobalt deposits in the world, and obviously cobalt, batteries, etc. So it's resource driven. I mean, South Africa was driven by the mining sector for the last century, but we've shifted into professional services, agriculture, tourism, as obviously we've depleted those resources. So South African mining companies are now active in Australia, South America, where all the deposits are. But countries, some are very dependent on resources, some have moved or, kind of matured on that economic scale into things like I say, professional services. So in terms of this funding, there's the big four. So, economically it makes sense, they're the big four. So in terms of attracting funding for PropTechs, for tech startups, they are the largest. So you can see the figures there and how it changes, it's shifting. Global, when you see the numbers drop on the previous graph as well in 23, that global VC funding really dried up in the last year or so, year or two. It was due to lots of factors, global economy. So you'll see that dropping, but that's a global trend, goes with economic cycles. So this is the first half of 2024, so the numbers are down, but it's quite clear where the hubs are. So interestingly, here's the sectors where this VC funding is going in Africa. So logistics and transport, it's not surprising because there's a big backlog of infrastructure development across the continent. So we're seeing some of the largest infrastructure projects in the world with foreign construction companies, funding coming in from across the globe. It's getting better, from roads to renewable energy is a big one. South Africa is in the middle of a massive wave of renewable energy. Interestingly, as a tale of, I guess, an emerging market country, things that might sound crazy if you live in the UK, but due to basically a corrupt government for 10 years, they severely damaged state-owned entities. So they basically looted them. We can all be honest here. So this is what we deal with. But we had a change in government, and rapidly there's been a shift. So the state power producer it's improved slightly, but it's almost beyond fixing. But it comes at an interesting time because we had big coal deposits, so we have lots of coal power stations and two nuclear, but it's almost out of necessity. The private sector's come in, and the government had to let the private sector in because they had no choice. We had rolling blackouts for years, so we actually have an app. It's improved, so since the new government we've had 200 days uninterrupted power supply, but for the last 3 years or so, we had an app where you add your neighborhood, and the app will tell you you're off from 8 a.m. to 12 p.m. your power is off. So it's interesting because we got quite sophisticated to deal with the problems. But now renewable energy, so it's funny because in the Nordics it's driven by government and civil society, the move to renewables. But for us it's because the non-renewable energy, it broke due to mismanagement. So it's interesting. Fintech, massive in Africa. Agri-tech, because it's a lot of countries in a sort of bread baskets. They're very big on agriculture, energy and water, again, infrastructure. Also ed tech, health tech, a lot of things to kind of bring services to people that don't have access to them. So it's really interesting. A lot of the tech is driven by often sort of dire need for power, for healthcare, for education. So African founders and private sector companies are very robust, hence why they do well overseas. So what is seen as risk in the UK for some South African financial services company it's not risk. We're used to dealing with inflation of 10-20%. Interest rates in Nigeria are 25%. So you have to be very dynamic and fluid and robust. So it really leads to, like I said, the tech ecosystem is really exciting and people are resilient. It's also very difficult and businesses fail. Obviously, it's not all wonderful. So global PropTech funding, just quickly, it's grown astronomically, and then due largely to economic conditions, it's dipped. The PropTech market, just quickly again, projections of value growing from about $34 billion. So in 2030, expected to be 80. So we're looking like 4x. And interesting, that's what, the 2030 vision in Saudi. If with the support Saudi's giving PropTech, you could ride that wave, obviously. Just in terms of like zooming in on the funding rounds. So like I said, overall funding is tricky, but some funding rounds are public. So interestingly enough, these are the most funded, so over the last few years. So the biggest is in Morocco. So that's Mubawab. So that's largely a listing platform. Flow is a South African company. It's basically automated digital social media marketing for estate agents. So it's ad tech, but focused on the property industry. Jumba is a construction materials marketplace. Construction is massively difficult in particularly West Africa, also East Africa. The supply, the procurement of materials, the quality of materials, the fluctuation in inflation it's really difficult. So you do your feasibility on a development. 8 months later, you're ready to break ground, but construction costs have risen 20%. So your feasibility is completely off, and rentals have only risen 4%. So these marketplaces, they give the obviously providers a place to sell, but they provide transparency. They help with pricing because you can see all the prices. A lot of issues with African markets is they're opaque, they're not transparent. So we see things like listing platforms, construction marketplaces. All of a sudden people can see what people are charging. So it actually levels pricing, and companies have to be competitive. So it's like technology helping that maturity that maybe you see in developed countries. Nawi in Egypt, also a listing platform. Meta Egypt, excuse me, in a similar vein. Split is Nigerian. It helps tackle the lack of transparency in housing. So it's a rental platform. So landlords and renters can use it. So renting in Nigeria and the hubs like Lagos is very difficult. It's expensive. So this basically was like an Airbnb model, because they just had, you couldn't go to a listing platform and you see, here's all the apartments in this part of Lagos. So, how do you know how to charge? It was just very messy. So they've done that. And the other thing is in Nigeria, you need to pay, if you rent an apartment, you got to pay rental 12 months in advance. So automatically a large portion of the population is excluded because you don't have that much cash. So companies like Split, and then the next one, Rent Small, they will give you sort of microfinance. So they'll lend you a year's rental, and then you will pay it back in monthly terms. So effectively, you're paying a monthly rental. They've done phenomenally well. So there's a very perhaps localized problem, and they use technology to address that. And they've had a social impact because they're increasing access to housing for people. But they've made a lot of money doing it. And it's interesting, in emerging markets, I often say, so by doing good socially, you can do very well financially. So it doesn't mean if you're having a positive social impact, because if there's no profit, you're not going to get private business doing it. So it's quite interesting. And then 2023, so a few of those companies were there. Peter talked about parking, so we've got also interesting Admit. So basically you get an app, you load your credit card, your car license, and you drive to a shopping center and the boom will open. When you leave, you get charged. So again, it might seem like a silly thing, parking, but that's really convenient. So you don't have to paper ticket and pay for parking. I'm not sure if you pay for parking at shopping malls and things in Saudi, but South Africa, Johannesburg, we're very car-centric, and you go to a lot of shopping malls and other things. The other thing is, if you're a company, you could give your guests access. So if you send your license plate number, as a visitor, thanks. Thank you. Yeah, so your visitor drives up and the boom just opens for them. It's good for security as well. How's Africa solves title issues? So it's hard to ascertain ownership and title. So for developers, they create a digital title to that property, and that moves through the transfer process. So for the developer, they've got digital records for all their units. Once it gets sold, everything is contained in that for the seller, the buyer, and moves to the bank, etc. And then going forward, they have this record. So when they resell, it's very transparent. So it reduces that risk of basically buying something that you don't actually buy from the real owner, because it happens. So that's first half of 2024. What would be interesting is South Africa is very sophisticated in retail. So ReTech is a property management platform, but it's driven by real AI and data for real estate landlords. So I think Riyadh's quite similar to Joburg in some ways. So I see a lot of shopping malls. So ReTech is interesting, and actually they've got clients in the UAE. So if that's of interest to you, if you're a landlord at all in retail, I'm not invested in this company, by the way. I stay very neutral. I'm an advisor, research on PropTech for real estate companies. But ReTech is, I just think, something quite interesting. So quickly, I just need to keep track of time. Let's just see. Okay, so very quickly, so these aren't total numbers of PropTechs, but in South Africa, I just wanted to break down where the PropTech categories, where things are happening. So this is quite common globally, so marketplace and transactions, so listing platforms and then platforms that aid in transaction. We've seen some at the conference, quite popular, and then operations and tools, which is property management. That's quite a global trend, so both of those are 2/3 of the market. You have data and analytics, flexible space, so space as a service is a very important trend for real estate. The way you package and sell and how users consume space is changing. Property fintech, it's a very big one. Interesting, in Nigeria, it's a massive fintech hub. So their property fintech sort of portion of startups of PropTechs is quite big. And then you'll see the operations, marketplace, the usual suspects. There's quite a small sample for Kenya, so big marketplace. So maybe it depicts a more immature PropTech market, but you're gonna see more operations and tools and data analytics coming. So, sorry. Another insight, just to understand where Africa is and on that PropTech maturity cycle, is accelerators and investors. So MetaProp was one of the first, and Pi Labs. So MetaProp's in New York, Pi Labs in London. So Luke, who spoke, is involved with Pi Labs. So 2015, they came onto the scene. So that's probably when the first time real interest came into PropTech. It had been around, but now you had formal investors targeting PropTech. So as you see, it's just under 10 years, so we're very, very, very early in the journey. Even if it's exciting what we've seen in 10 years, it's only the very, very beginning. So this sector will grow, like we saw, the market will at least, by the end of the decade, at least 3x, but it could be more. So you had those in 2015, Fifth Wall, another big US VC, 2016, and Concretes in the UK, 2016. So you saw that. Now there's a lot since then. Brigade Reap in India, that's a really good PropTech supporter accelerator, 2016. In Africa, PropTech 54 in Nigeria is an accelerator. 21 Redimension Capital is the first PropTech focused VC on the continent. That's in South Africa. 21. So obviously, in line with other things, we lag the developed world, but often in innovation, we're comparable or better. You've got to look at these things. So African events and associations, so there's the Africa PropTech Forum, which is part of the biggest real estate conference in Africa. So if you're interested in Africa, you should go to the the African Property Investment Summit, which is annually in September, either in Johannesburg or Cape Town, and it attracts developers, landlords, etc., from the continent. And as part of that is the Africa PropTech Forum, which is the biggest PropTech event on the continent. And they're very professionally run conferences, very, very worthwhile if you're interested in the continent. I'm a co-founder of PropTech Africa and the South African SA PropTech Association. So that was in 2018 and 2019. So there wasn't much happening at all in terms of, there were PropTechs, but there wasn't any industry conversation or anything. And then PropTech Nigeria was also 2019. So just to end off, these are some successful PropTechs in the three major sub-Saharan African markets of South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya. So South Africa's RETEC, I mentioned. GCX is a very sophisticated platform to help landlords and actually other organizations like retail, insurance, to gather the right data, to clean that data, manage that data, but all to inform sustainability measures across different areas. So they process the data and they extract the value for monitoring, reporting, control. And they're currently expanding. Their clients in South Africa are the biggest landlords, insurance firms, retailers, and they are active in Kenya, Malaysia, Europe. They're going into the UK. So they're obviously in the right place at the right time, and they've over 10 years. So they started when it was too early, and the business made no money for 6 years, but the last, say, 4 years, they've been exploding. Inner Space is space as a service, so like co-working, flexible office, but they do it for micro-industrial, which is really interesting. So they buy these old industrial parks, and they create smaller units, and it's for, say you make leather goods, you're a small business, you need a workshop, and perhaps you need distribution. So perhaps you're a small retailer, you sell online, you just need a small logistics place. And then you get flexible leases, so maybe 3 months, 6 months. So it helps entrepreneurs and small to medium-sized enterprises access this really important space. And like flexible office, you get a lot of business support and amenities. And they've exploded, and it's quite likely they'll go overseas, look at other markets. Nigeria, we looked at Rent Small, House Africa. State Intel is data, so they're tackling the lack of transparency, been very effective at gathering data and producing really good insights. And Sitemap is linked to House Africa, does geolocation. I saw some PropTechs downstairs that are doing the same. And then lastly, so Rent Score in Kenya, there's a lack of data, so credit records are hard for landlords to vet potential tenants. So Rent Score uses clever AI to gather certain data and produce a credit score and also facilitate the rental process. So again, solving a local issue where, because of a lack of infrastructure and sophistication in financial services and credit, people didn't have credit records, but they might be financially sound and able to rent, but the landlord can't vet them. But that's quite interesting. Jumba is a construction marketplace. Kyoto Pay plays in the rental payment space. Cubic is linked to construction, and Alfablo is data and insight as well. I think I might be over time. So just to end, bring a proud South Africa and seeing all these mega mixed-use projects. We visited the Al Fura suburb last night. We were very warmly hosted there. So this is the biggest, I guess you call it mega development. So it's a city because it has everything a city needs: schools, hospitals, shopping center, offices, green space, housing, from apartments to big houses. It's developed by TAC, and it's won numerous global awards for mixed-use development, for smart city implementation. So, like I said, it's interesting. South Africa has very sophisticated retail developers and landlords and managers. So, it might be an interesting case study. So, it's in Johannesburg, just sort of very close to the center, but just on the outskirts. And it's been massively successful. It's attracted the African headquarters of PwC, Deloitte, and others. The shopping mall is one of the biggest on the continent, and the shopping mall has 15,000 solar panels. Because, like I said, there's a big shift to renewables. So they've got they produce energy. They have some of their own water infrastructure. It's a fully smart city, from traffic to tracking, sewage and water drainage, all sorts of things. And obviously, the buildings themselves are smart. So the Deloitte building is a very, very good example of a very smart-enabled building in various ways. So yeah, this is, it's quite cool, and you're proud of your country, and I'm proud of the real estate sector. So that's quite an achievement. And I believe that's it. So thank you very much. And I just want to also say I read that the hospitality and the welcome is very warm in Saudi, and I have experienced that. So it's been wonderful, and thank you for your time.